Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 6 lecture, where we're going to discuss police-juvenile relations as well as police processing of youthful offenders. Our learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to summarize the history of police-juvenile relationships, summarize the police's attitudes toward juveniles, summarize juveniles' attitudes toward the police, describe police discretion and the factors that influence discretion, summarize how police process juveniles, describe the legal rights of arrested juveniles, describe how police agencies are structured to deal with juvenile crime, and summarize developing trends in how police deal with juveniles. So some of the reasons we have issues between police and juveniles and having police specifically work with juveniles is that police sometimes see juvenile work as less than real work. They don't see juvenile crime as being sort of real crime because there's a lot of due processes that simply tie the officers' hands with how they're able to handle the cases. And they feel like the juveniles are let off too easy and they don't have the same abilities that they do with adults. There's a lot more rules. And honestly, juveniles just tend to be very hostile towards police officers. So they also have to serve a broad spectrum of offenders. So you have everybody from status offenders to murderers. And between that, you have juveniles who are running away, who are mentally ill, some who are neglected or abused. You're seeing youth who are victimized or victimizing. So it can be really hard to work with juveniles because it's hard to wrap your head around sometimes the things that they're capable of, but also the things other people are capable of doing to juveniles. So it's a very special field to be in, and you have to be a very special person to want to work directly and just with juveniles who are involved in the system, whether that's delinquent youth or those who are dependent and neglected. So let's talk a little bit about the history of police-juvenile relations. So considering socialization, youth are really taught rules of society from birth. So historically, when youth violated the law, the family, a lot of times the church or the community would step in and handle that. But then we have this industrialization and urbanization that happens, which really reduced the effectiveness of those informal social controls. And then therefore we saw an increase in violence among juveniles. So it wasn't until the 1830s and 1840s when we had full-time police forces being established in large cities, and they had the power to arrest, but they used really informal methods. And unfortunately, you saw a lot of corruption and abuse of power happening during that time. When we now look at modern policing, juvenile policing, we had police athletic leagues in the 1920s that were really created and designed to provide youth with safe playgrounds and pro-social programs that they could engage in. And this expanded in the 1960s to include some leadership and even moral training. Then in the 1930s, you had this formation of a juvenile division or juvenile bureau where these officers were solely juvenile officers. And we do still see that now in certain police departments. I've seen police departments where there's one specific detective assigned to handle all juvenile cases. Again, because there's so many rules and caveats that go along with what you can and cannot do with juveniles. For example, if a juvenile is arrested, they only have 4 hours in Pennsylvania from the time of arrest to either place that juvenile in detention or some type of a placement or shelter, or they have to release the juvenile. 6 hours. So that's the only amount of time that they have. So they have to get all of their investigation and everything done within that amount of time, which can be very hard to work under those constraints. You're also dealing with the families and parents that want to protect their children. So then a few years later, 1955, we had the Central States Juvenile Officers Association. And then around the same time, the International Juvenile Officers Association developed, where they really developed responsibilities, standards, and procedures for police officers that were working specifically with juveniles. Unfortunately, budgetary restrictions came in the 70s to the 90s, which really forced some of those juvenile divisions to be disbanded, or they were only focusing on dependent, neglected, and abused youth, not focusing on delinquent youth. So really what we have now is really problem-oriented policing or community-based policing, which came about in the late 1990s to 2010. So this problem-oriented policing is where it's a policy where police really responded to the circumstances that created the juvenile problems rather than the incidents themselves. So trying to fix the community rather than trying to fix the juvenile, because you can take the juvenile out of the community, but if you don't fix it and you put them back in it, you're going to have the same problems. So what are police attitude toward juvenile crime look like? Well, police see themselves as skilled to arrest, but a lot of times they think, again, that nothing is going to happen to youth that they apprehend unless it's a really serious offense. Police also tend to be guarded in those juvenile encounters because juveniles are very unpredictable and they're resistant, which really just makes arresting them even tougher. And police often find that they have to really defend the authority of their position from verbal and physical abuse that they take from juveniles on scene. So juvenile officers and detectives are more service oriented, and they often have to develop really a good rapport with the youth, which is why it's great that we can have police departments that have solely juvenile officers and juvenile detectives, because they become then well known to, again, remember most of your violent, serious crime, 75% of that is a very small portion of the juvenile offender population. So they get to know those kids well. They get to know the community well. That way, when the juvenile messes up again, they get to come in and say, come on, man, like, what's going on? They get to build that rapport slowly with them. So it's not just a random officer responding to the scene. They can really develop and have that more thorough background knowledge of what in this environment and context is bringing this out of this child. So now, what are juveniles' attitudes toward the police? Well, youth who have had contact with the police tend to have more negative attitudes toward them. We know that race, quality of service of police services, and previous experience with the police often affect any citizen's attitudes. So it especially is going to affect the juveniles. We also know that younger, single, blue collar, those who are poorly educated and or underemployed reported having a less positive image than individuals who are older and married, who have white-collar jobs, who are more highly educated, and who are employed. Moreover, global attitudes toward the police are really found in larger socio-cultural contexts, which can affect the youth's assessment of specific police contacts. Again, with social media being so big, and just even the media in general, youth are more aware of other instances and global attitudes about the police, which can then impact how they assess when they come in contact with a police officer, how that interaction is going to go. And we also know that younger children, those who are Caucasian, female, and from upper middle class who are youth, they did tend to report more favorable attitudes toward the police. They may also have, again, going back to the first point here, less contact with the police in their neighborhoods by nature. Now, police have discretion in how they can handle a juvenile's case. So the police discretion, it's really a choice that the officer makes between two or more possible means of handling the situation. They still need to be professional and personal, but they can determine whether they're going to divert the youth from the system or really enter them into it. And it's important to know that only about 10 to 20% of all police contact with youth become official contacts. So it's not, I think people have this assumption that every time the police respond to a call, someone gets arrested. And it's just not the case. There's so many other options that they have with juveniles that they don't all come to the attention then of the juvenile courts. So typically, if the juvenile is coming to the attention of the juvenile court and is being handled formally, there's more going on to that story. So what are some factors that determine the police disposition of a juvenile? Well, the first one is offense seriousness, which really is the most important factor that they consider. How serious is the offense that they've allegedly committed? They have to take into account citizen complaints. So if a citizen made a complaint and they stuck around and they want to press charges, it is more likely that the youth is going to be arrested. Gender is a factor. So females are less likely to be arrested historically. However, they're more likely to be arrested for violating traditional role expectations. So, for example, obeying their parents or running away from home, or if they're being sexually promiscuous, they are more likely to be arrested in those instances. Again, going back to, do we feel the need to protect these female juvenile offenders? Race, so racial bias makes minority groups targets of police, although research shows that African Americans and other minority groups commit more serious offenses. We also know socioeconomic status is a factor. So lower class youth tend to be thrust into the system for offenses that middle and upper class youth would be sent home for. Again, some of it comes down to, is the parent willing to have the child back in the home? Is the parent available to do that? Can they provide adequate supervision? And maybe if they're coming from a lower class, maybe there's only one parent present in the household, whereas in upper middle class, maybe you have two parents present where they're able, or those of higher class, they're able to pay for a private service to come in. So they're not in need of the system. They don't need services from the system. Individual characteristics of the youth, so things such as their prior record or having prior contacts with the police. Their age is taken into account, and who their friends are, who the police know that they tend to hang around with. The conduct of the parents, all of that bears weight on whether the juvenile is going to be arrested. We also take into account the police-juvenile interactions. So we know that juveniles who are more disrespectful during that interaction are also more likely to be arrested. The demeanor of the juvenile. So how are they acting? Are they out of control? Are they being respectful? Even the officer's personality is going to come into play. Are they someone who's more law enforcement and enforcer based? Or do they have more of a treatment and rehabilitative mindset? Do they want to see maybe how they can work with the juvenile? Departmental policy. So sometimes having more professional police departments, they tend to refer more youth to court because there's less discretion for that officer. They have more policy and procedure that are set in stone that says, if this happens, you do this. And sometimes it's good because it takes the discretion out. So you don't have someone being disproportionately, or certain category of youth being disproportionately impacted. But then again, you have more being referred to the court simply because they don't have that discretion to be able to say, no, we can divert you. And then there's external pressures. So you have the pressures, the attitudes of the press and the public. You also have to consider the status of the victim and what the victim's asking for, how the victim was impacted, and what resources are even available outside of the juvenile justice system. If the juvenile is not formally charged and placed into the system, are they going to have the ability to address their behaviors and these issues? So considering the police processing of juveniles, we have informal options, a combination, and formal options. So when we consider informal options, these are on the street or at the station. They can simply ignore the behavior. They can try and make friendships with the juveniles to really form those relationships and foster those relationships with the community. They can maybe, for example, so here's a soccer game happening in the street. They can just suggest they take it over to the park. Nobody needs to be arrested for that. They can talk to the youth about their wrongful behavior. Maybe pull them into the station to scare them a little bit and just have a stern talking to with them. Hey, you shouldn't steal that necklace or that candy bar from the store. It's not right. Talk to them about it. Or even just writing down their name for future reference. Hey, this happens again, we're going to have a different conversation. At the station, they can also do things like speaking with the youth and the parent and then just send them home. Some departments also will have sort of a youth bureau who will counsel the youth and maybe make referrals to community service agencies such as anger management or counseling, or if they need drug and alcohol help. They will work with school personnel and sometimes even contact probation to see what other informal options are available. Some of the informal and formal, so they could maybe arrest the juvenile, book them and process them, but then release the juvenile, so not actually formally file the charges, but they're processed. Or they could notify social service agencies like the Office of Children and Youth, CYS, DHS, notifying those agencies so they're not putting them through the criminal juvenile justice system, the delinquency part, but they're referring them to another social service agency, which could help address their behaviors. Now, some of the legal rights of juveniles when they're interacting with the police have to be taken into consideration. So looking at search and seizure and the Fourth Amendment, we have first here Mapp versus Ohio, where it says that evidence collected in unreasonable searches and seizures where there was not a proper search warrant is inadmissible in court. This is the exclusionary rule. We then had State v. Lowry, where it applied the Fourth Amendment to juveniles. So it hadn't been applied to juveniles before then. And Arizona v. Gant, which says that police can search passenger compartments if there is a reasonable belief that the person being arrested might grab something while they're searching, or if it contains evidence relevant to the arrest that they're stopping them for right then. And then we have New Jersey versus TLO, which defined the legality of school searches, saying that they didn't require a warrant or probable cause that a crime is being committed because you're on school property. We then have to consider interrogations and confessions. So the juvenile must be read the Miranda warnings. The juvenile also has the right to an attorney during questioning. Now in Haley v. Ohio, the age of the juvenile, the duration of questioning, and the absence of having counsel or a parent present all now play a role in how constitutional a confession is when it was being obtained. So it all plays into the constitutionality of how the officer obtained that confession. Fair v. Michael applied then the totality of the circumstances approach to juvenile interrogations. So we need to look at the totality of the circumstances, not just one specific instance. So specifically, Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be compelled to be a witness against themselves. And then the 14th Amendment tells us that no person should be deprived of life, liberty, or property without having due process. So again, that's why we have these rights here now for juveniles, Miranda warnings, and right to an attorney during questioning. Now, some states even take it one step farther and require that a parent or an attorney be present for questioning, and that questioning has to take place somewhere else other than a police station, because obviously with a police station comes even some level of coercion even there, because a juvenile may be very nervous. It's a very formal setting, so they require those questionings to happen elsewhere. Now, juveniles are fingerprinted, and some states require actually the judge's permission, and the judge controls who has access to those fingerprints. In other states, the police control what that policy looks like. So what it does say, though, in Davis v. Mississippi is that fingerprints that are taken by the police can't be used as evidence. So as part of the processing of if you formally process a juvenile through the system, so they're processed, they're being charged, part of that processing is being fingerprinted. So what this says is that you can't use those fingerprints from processing as then evidence. You have to go and get yourself a search warrant to actually obtain the fingerprints for further analysis for evidence. When we consider lineups and photographs, the offender must have an attorney at the initial identification lineup. And it says that in United States v. Wade, that the accused has the right to have counsel present at any post-indictment lineup. So they have that right. They don't have to, though. In Kirby v. Illinois, we said that the above right actually goes into effect as soon as the complaint or the indictment is issued. So one issue we have is with single suspect lineup, which prejudices the offender because the victim may just assume that the assailant that person is the assailant, even if they never saw them before, just because by the very nature of the police catching this person and saying, hey, do you think this is them? There's all of this preconceived ideas that, well, that person must be guilty. And then when we talk about photographs, showing only one photograph to a victim is also prejudicial for the same reasons. And photographing juveniles at the time of questioning can also be biased and stigmatizing to them. So police may review photos of juveniles when they're looking for a suspect and simply pick a juvenile out because they've seen the photo too many times. So these are things we have to consider when we talk about lineups and photographs that police have to keep in mind. Now, talking about the police and prevention of juvenile crime. So how can the police prevent juvenile crime from happening? Well, you have some community options, school-based and gang-based. When we talk about community, it's important that they're cultivating good relationships with the youth and the parents in the community. Also with teachers and staff and local organizations, even having good relationships with school administrations and the juvenile court so they can all work together. Having specialized units for different areas of juvenile offending, whether that's missing children, missing and exploited children, juvenile crime or child abuse, or even gangs can be helpful for community-based focused work. When we talk about school-based, some effective delinquency prevention programs that we can teach in school are things like school safety and drug and alcohol abuse, or even bicycle safety and talking about court proceedings. So we know that DARE is actually very ineffective, but for some reason it continues to receive funding because it looks good. But you have the GREAT program, which is actually a 13-week middle school program. They also have an elementary curriculum, a summer program, and family training. What they found here was that it actually did not reduce involvement in gangs or crime, but what it did do was improve positive attitudes and relationships with the police. So while it maybe didn't accomplish its initial goal, it did have a positive outcome. And then the LRE, those law-related education programs. These teach youth fundamental principles and skills so they can just simply be productive members of society. And what we found is that these actually decrease involvement in delinquency and with delinquent peers, and they're less likely to use violence to resolve conflict when they engage with these programs. And they also address delinquent-related behaviors in the schools. These are more school-based programs, such as having SROs in the school or what they call CIS, cops in school. So just having that police presence there in the school, one, they're able to improve relationships with the students, with the juveniles who are then part of their community, but they're also able to address issues as they come up immediately with these youth, and the school doesn't have to wait for someone to respond. Some of the gang-based programs, it's important to know, obviously we had gangs increase dramatically in the late 1980s, and drugs and violence were major issues with these gangs. So there's a youth service program, which was designed to deal with specific gang problems while they were performing their regular duty. So it wasn't actually for a permanent unit. Or you have gang details where officers are assigned specifically to gang problems and they don't work on any other assignments at all. Or a formalized permanent gang unit where all they do is address gang activity. A lot of probation departments, I will say, also have gang units if there's a major city within there, like Philadelphia County, Berks County, and Dauphin County. Talking about then gang and gun-based interventions. So again, those youth service programs I just talked about, there's gang details and gang units. So police departments really may have youth service programs where police can address the gang issue, but again, it's not really formalized. Gang details, they're sort of detailed to that for now, but it's not a whole full unit, or you have an actual whole unit. And Operation Ceasefire, which started in Boston in the early to mid 90s, was really there to address the high youth homicide rates, and they used problem-oriented policing to address those gang hotspots. but also used a multidisciplinary team to crack down on that gang activity. So they used their probation and the prosecutors as well as the police. And what they saw was a decrease in youth homicides by 63%. They also decreased the monthly number of shots fired by 25% and decreased the monthly number of youth gun assaults by 44%. So we see here how using problem-oriented policing, specifically addressing the gang issue, and multidisciplinary teams are very effective at reducing not just gun violence, homicide, but also violent crimes. Now, formalizing the police referral programs, what we have to consider are how many at-risk youth actually require referrals and how many services do we actually have that exist for these youth. Which programs do we have available that are going to meet the department's standards, and develop means and frequency of evaluating those programs, because if we don't know if they work, we don't want to continue to use them, right? And then beginning intervention processes as early as possible. We don't want to wait until there's a problem. So Project SHIELD was one in the Westminster Police Department in Orange County, California. Here, the police are the first responders to situations because they know the community best, and then using multidisciplinary teams to refer the juvenile for appropriate services are really shown to be effective. In sum, the early 1990s, police became aware of juvenile crime problem. In the 1920s and 30s, the PAL formed. In the 1950s and 1960s, juvenile police officers associations were formed. And then in the 80s and 90s, because of budgetary restrictions, they really had to restrict the juvenile programs that they were offering. And today we have a current focus on problem-oriented policing. Police attitudes toward youth are more positive today, but they're deterred by the need to defend their authority and also deal with the unpredictability of youth behaviors. Younger children, those of white race, girls, and middle and upper class youth actually have more favorable attitudes toward the police than their counterparts. And police discretion is the officer's choice between two or more options, and it's impacted by numerous individual, community, and departmental factors. Police can also process youth informally, formally, or use a combination. Arrested juveniles have rights related to search and seizure, interrogation practices, being fingerprinted, and pretrial identification practices. And police utilize both school, community, and gang-based interventions to address juvenile crime. And finally, the police do continue to support prevention efforts and referring juveniles to community agencies rather than having to always formally process them. So this was your Chapter 6 lecture looking at police-juvenile relations and police processing of juveniles. I hope that everyone has just a wonderful week.